When I was about 15 years old, the church I attended there at that time did a youth musical where there's some drama and there were lots of songs with it, and it was called Friends Forever, and there's some artwork from it. Look at that. You know how old it was because it's got that 80s ghetto blaster there and everything. Oh, great fun. And we got together and we did that. It was based on a popular Michael W. Smith song at the time called Friends Forever. Michael W. Smith, he was huge in Christian circles. I mean, he was the guy. Everyone loved him. Everyone knew the song. And so we did this musical. I was in it, and Mike Steiner was in it. He played our teacher, Rosie, Mr. Rosenthal. And I was going to test him if he was here to see if he still remembered some of his lines. And I bet he would have. I was going to feed him, and I bet he would have remembered his lines. But we did that. And the way it was, the musical was, there was this class of students, and the teacher came in and gave them an assignment. He said, by the time I return at the end of class, I want you to have written me, each of you, an essay about what is a friend. What is a friend? And the teacher goes and does what he needs to do, and the students are there in the classroom, and they're like, well, this is the dumbest question ever, you know, and they think this is going to be really easy, and they say, let's just get this done so we can goof off the rest of the period. And while they sit down and start writing, and they realize, it's not such an easy question. What is a friend? And so for the rest of the musical, we see them going back and forth with each other, sharing ideas about what is a friend. What do friends do? And one of the students writes a very elaborate poem, the nerdy one. And one of the students writes an acrostic poem, the less nerdy one, using the word friend. It says, F is for the fun we have. R is for how radical you are, because back in the 80s we could use radical like that, right? Radical. I is for your individuality. E is for your ever-loving heart. N is because I hope it never ends. Groan. And D is because I die without my friends. So we had that, and so they keep going through. And toward the end of the musical, they finally get around to asking this one character named Mark, which is a great name for a character, I think. And they ask him, Mark, what do you think is a friend? And Mark, played by yours truly in a crack casting decision, right? Mark's playing Mark. Mark answers, well, a friend is someone who would die for you. And they're like, ooh, good one. And they're like, they start sharing stories they've heard about people dying for other people. And the one girl shares a story about something she heard in the news about a guy who was killed in a fire in his home. And when they went in afterward, he was there, but they removed his burned body, and his daughter was alive underneath him, and he had given his life to protect her and to save her. And they're like, ooh, good one. And they finally get around, they say, Mark, do you have a friend like that? And much to their surprise, he says, yes, I do. And they're like, ooh, who is it? You gotta tell us. And of course he says, well, it's Jesus. He's the best friend I've ever had. Not so surprising, given that it was written to be performed in a church in 1989, but still very dramatic and very true. This idea that was being tapped into by the musical writers of a friend being someone who would give his life for you. They seem to be tapping right into what Jesus is teaching in this scripture lesson we have today, because Jesus, he comes to the Last Supper with his disciples, and he comes and tells them, he says, greater love has no one than this, that he lays down his life for his friends. And Jesus says this, knowing that by this time tomorrow, he will have fully demonstrated completely what he means here. Jesus will go to the cross and die, offering up his perfect life as a sacrifice to save his disciples, to save his friends. Not only the 11 gathered with him there, but anyone throughout the ages who would come and follow after him. He dies, he gives up his life to save them from hell. That's the gospel, that all who call on his name and follow him would be saved. So Jesus tells them this. He says, the greatest love is that which will lead you to give up your own life for your friend if you need to. And wow, can you imagine you're just sitting around dinner and someone starts saying that? That's kind of morbid, right? You know, why is he saying these things to them? Well, why does he tell them now? And where does this come from? It seems like, wow, that would just be something to blurt out, but it actually doesn't come from left field. Jesus starts it earlier. The things I read you in chapter 13, verse 34, Jesus says, my command is this, that you love one another. And so he starts into it again in chapter 15, verse 12. My command is this, love each other as I have loved you. And it's like Jesus saying, and how much much have I loved you? I loved you so much that I died for you. You see, he hasn't done it yet, but he knows by this time tomorrow he will have. And his disciples are going to remember what he has said. So he has given them this ultimate example of the definition of love because he doesn't want them misunderstanding what he says. He says, love one another. Well, what does that mean? Because when we say love, we use it a lot of different ways, don't we? I got to tell you, I love Mountain Dew. Haven't had any in 3.5 weeks, but I love it, right? I love my ice cream. I bought a 3-gallon tub of Baskin-Robbins pumpkin ice cream a week and a half ago at Shop Shopper for $9. I'm as happy as a lark, whatever that means, because I love my ice cream, right? And we use it in different ways. You might say, yeah, I love the Pittsburgh Steelers, or I love my dog, or I love shopping, or I love the church. I love my mom, I love my dad, I love my kids, I love my spouse. You see, we use that word, and all those things there, you better not be using that word love in the same way for all those things. There are lots of ways we talk about love. Even in the language Jesus uses, there were multiple ways to say love. Jesus chooses one of those words, but even that word can be interpreted different ways. So Jesus makes it clear when he tells his disciples to love one another what he's meaning. See, he's letting them know clearly, hey, there's no cheap way out of this one. This love, it requires something costly from you. He wants his disciples to get right what he means when he tells them to love one another, because there's a lot riding on this. If you catch, he tells them to love one another in chapter 13, verse 34. And then in the next verse, he says, by this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. It's like Jesus saying, how you love one another within the fellowship of believers, that is what defines you as my followers to the rest of the world. How you love one another defines to the rest of the world what it means to actually follow me. How you love one another defines to the rest of the world what my love really is. You've got to get it right, because how often do we hear people who have heard about something that has gone on in the church, or they've seen something that has gone on in the church, they've experienced it, and they say, have you heard this? Well, if that's what it means to follow Jesus, I don't want any part of him. Or they'll say, well, I don't go to church because I've been hurt too badly by people there in the past. Isn't this what happens? And a lot of people will say those things, and to some people that's an excuse. Just get out of living the life that Jesus calls them to live. But many people who say that, they say it with a sincere conviction. There are many people out there who want nothing to do with the church because they have experienced how we love one another. And I think that's one of the reasons Jesus gives this ultimate example when he tells us to love one another. He doesn't want us getting this wrong. He says, I call you to a great love. And you can't get a greater love than being willing to die for one another. This love Jesus calls us to, it requires something. It requires us to be involved with one another and to help each other at the expense of our own lives. That's what Jesus is calling us to here. That seems to be how Jesus, that's how he's defining love. That's how he's defining friendship. Because he says, you got to love, you die for your friends. And he goes on to keep talking about friends. In chapter 15, verse 4, he says, you are my friends if you do what I command. You see, he says, you got to listen to me on this. And we all want to be Jesus' friend, right? Isn't that great? Jesus is my friend. We sing songs about it. What a friend we have in Jesus. Oh, sacred friend. Oh, holy friend. We sing because we all like this idea of being Jesus' friend. But Jesus tells us, if you want to be called my friend, you've got to go with me on this one. You must love one another the way I'm describing here. That's friendship with me. But what does Jesus mean? Again, what does he mean when he talks about being a friend? What does he mean? Because even in Jesus' time, that word friend had multiple meanings. It was used multiple ways. A military or a political alliance was known as a friendship. Or when a king took care of lower people, and they were called clients, that was called being friendly or extending friendship to them. Or even the Pharisees, some of the religious leaders in Jesus' time, they met in circles of friends. And today we use the term friend for many different things as well. So what does it mean when Jesus says to be my friend? He relates friends to this type of love of one another. He goes on to clarify. Again, he doesn't want us getting it wrong. In chapter 15, verse 15, he says, I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father, I've made known to you. See, Jesus says, you are my friends. We're all called to serve God. We're all called to serve Jesus, but he says, I do you one better. I call you friends. See, and he wants us to get this. He says, I want you to follow my example of love and be friends to one another instead of just mere servants. Because you see, friends and servants, they kind of serve the same purpose in some ways, right? What do they have in common? A friend and a servant. Well, they both help you, don't they? If I decide I'm going to paint my living room, and suddenly I have a servant, and I say to him, well, part of your job this week is you help me paint my living room. He helps me paint my living room. But rather than that, I'm going to paint my living room, and I say to a friend, hey, this weekend I'm going to paint my living room. Do you want to come help me? And my friend will come help me because he knows me. He knows what I'm about. He knows about my life, and in that there is affection. And he just wants to come and help me. See, there's a difference. The servant does it out of an obligation. The friend does it because he's part of my life. He's involved with me. Jesus says a servant doesn't know his master's business, but a friend does. This idea of being a friend and how we are to relate to one another, Jesus gives it there. There's a great example of what it means to be a friend rather than a servant in the life of Abraham, the father of the people of Israel in the Old Testament. See, Abraham, it might not surprise those of you who know about Abraham that the Bible and Scripture describes him as being a servant of God. And that's not surprising because we read in the Scripture that everything God tells Abraham to do, Abraham goes and does. He serves God. It might be surprising to know that God himself in Isaiah 41:8 calls Abraham his friend. Now, what makes Abraham more than just a servant? What makes him a friend? We see it in Genesis chapter 18. The Lord comes with two of his angels, and he comes to visit Abraham. Now this is unusual, right? God doesn't usually do this. But the Lord comes to earth to visit Abraham. And Abraham, being nearly 100 years old at this point, he refers to himself as the servant of God, Lord's servant. And so he drops everything. He gives up his noonday rest, and he hurries around so that he can offer hospitality to the Lord and his two angels. And so he goes and he starts preparing a meal, and he hurries to tell the other people who are parts of his household. He tells them, quickly, get this meal ready, get it ready. See, he's giving that illustration of the perfect servant. And an ever the true servant, when the meal is ready, it is served. And Abraham doesn't sit with the Lord and his guests, but he stands by, waiting to do what they need. He's ever that true servant. You see, we see in this example in Genesis 18, Abraham is the servant of God. What makes him God's friend? You see, we get that afterward. After the Lord and the angels are done eating, God starts describing to Abraham why he's there, what he intends to do, what his plans are. God involves Abraham in his business. Abraham knows the Lord's business, and that's what makes him a friend. Remember, Jesus said a servant doesn't know his master's business, but a friend does. So that's how Abraham is the friend of God. Not just that he serves them, but he's involved together. They are working together. It seems that at the Last Supper, Jesus comes and he meets with his disciples, and he's telling them that to love one another with this kind of love he has shown, we have to become more than just servants to one another. We can't just be doing things for each other because it's an obligation. To become friends and love one another, we have to be up in each other's business. I mean, not to be nosy or overstep some sort of barrier or something, no. But you can't really love someone if you don't know what they're about. You can't really love someone if you don't know why they're going through what they're going through, if you don't know why they're reacting to it that way, if you don't know where they've been and where they're going. See, this is why when people say, well, I don't have to attend church, or I don't have to attend church very often to be a follower of Jesus Christ, I gotta tell them they're wrong. Because following Jesus obediently means living with one another in the fellowship and loving one another there. That's the church. You can't do that in the level that Jesus commands us to do here unless you are intimately involved with the people of the congregation, unless you are friends, as Jesus defines it here. Love one another. Make yourselves known to one another. Be part of each other's lives. That's what Jesus is saying. And that means in a congregation this size, loving one another means you should probably know everyone who attends here on a regular basis. If you don't, you're probably not loving the way Jesus commands here. If there's someone here who attends on a regular basis and you have never spoken to them, or you haven't spoken to them in months or even weeks, you're probably not loving the way Jesus commands here. If you're not opening yourself up to interact with the people of the congregation on a regular basis, then you're probably not loving the way Jesus commands here. Because that's the start of loving one another in such a way that leads to the willingness to lay down your life for them. And Jesus says that's the ultimate show of love. He says, we need to be involved in each other's lives. You can't do that if you're just not even really communicating or talking with each other or participating in things with each other. Proximity, being in the same general space Sunday mornings or whenever, that's not good enough. You see, I found a story this week about two men who enrolled in the Army, and they enlisted at Fort Sheridan, Illinois, and they were sent together in the same troop movement to Texas, where they underwent training, and they were there, they worked together for weeks, and they trained together, and they shared a bunk for weeks, and by the end of that time, they were pretty close. And so as they were preparing to go separate ways in different deployments, they decided they would exchange addresses. And they found that one of them lived at 2533 South Troy Street, Chicago. The other one lived at 2541, same street, same city. You see, they had lived near each other, neighbors, but they weren't friends. So you've got to be more than just close. We can be positioned close to one another, but even though we're positioned here together, are we really friends the way Jesus teaches us we need to be? You see, sometimes I am amazed at how often I get someone calling me up or sending me an email message or a Facebook message and saying, can you tell so-and-so this? Or can you make sure so-and-so knows I need this from them? Or sometimes it even happens Sunday morning. I'll be standing somewhere in the church and you call up to say, hey, can you tell so-and-so this or about this thing? Or can you get this information from them? And I'm standing there and I'm thinking, I usually don't say it, but I'm standing there and I'm thinking, they're right there. Go talk to them. Go be part of their life. Or I'm on Facebook. I'm friends with you on Facebook. I'm friends with you on Facebook. And I know you're friends with them on Facebook. Send them a message. Be part of their lives. Or, it's so great. This day and age, we have these things known as phones. And like you can get on here and you know what you can do? You can dial a number and you can call up and you can talk to people. You can be part of their lives. You can be involved with them. The way Jesus said, we can do that. Know each other. Is it any wonder the world is looking at the church and saying, well, there's just nothing new there for me. I don't need to be part of that. We're not loving each other the way Jesus commands. We're not part of each other's lives. Jesus said, love each other as I have loved you. And this kind of love requires something from us. It requires commitment, saying, I will be there. Nothing is going to get ahead of this because this is what I've said is important. As followers of Jesus Christ, we are called to be committed to God and His plan for our lives, but we are also called to be committed to one another. That's why to follow Jesus properly, you must, on a regular basis, be meeting with other believers. You got to do it. Not only when it's convenient, not only when you feel like it, or when nothing better comes along, or I guess I can do it now, but it takes that commitment. The commitment is required to love Jesus as He commands here. You see, that's a choice. We can choose to do that, or we choose not to. It requires being in each other's business. It requires sacrifice. Listen, it might require us to go somewhere or do something or give something up for somebody so we can give up our own desires so we can meet the needs or desires of somebody else within the church. Jesus says this. He says the greatest love you can show is laying down your life for a friend. But then later that same evening, he's going to be in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's going to be praying to the Father, and he's going to be saying, Father, take this cup from me. He's laying it all out there before the Father. He doesn't want to go through what's going to happen. Or maybe there's a little bit of fear of what's coming. Torture and crucifixion. And he makes that prayer, but you know what? He goes through with it. He goes to the cross, and he gives up his life. He sets his desires aside, and maybe even some fear, to love us the way he tells us to love one another. This love Jesus commands requires something from us, and so often we are unwilling to give it. And we become disobedient to Jesus and what he's saying here. We are to love one another. Jesus says to love one another. And you know what's so great about when Jesus says love one another? The verb tense he uses, it means it's not just a one-time thing. I showed them love, I'm done. No, it means to love one another and love one another and love one another. Keep on loving. You remember the old REO Speedwagon song? Who wants to sing it with me? I'm gonna keep on loving you. Right? But that's the attitude Jesus says we are to have toward one another. You can only, get this, you can only die for someone. How many times can you die for someone? Once. Jesus says that's the greatest example of love, dying for someone. So until you get to the point where you might have to do that, you just keep loving. You keep loving. You keep loving forever. See, on the last night, Jesus met with his disciples. The last time, he's going to have to instruct them on important things for their lives, on holy living and following him. Jesus says this, if you're my friend, you're going to obey my command. My command is this, love one another. That requires you to become friends. That you invest in and become involved in one another's lives. It says, don't be satisfied with halfway or shallow love, but go deep. And he says, I'll show you the greatest way. Greater love has no one than this, that he lays down his life for his friends. And everyone in the church worldwide must look and say, are we really living like that within the fellowship? Jesus calls his disciples, his followers, he calls them friends here. And he proves his friendship. His death of his own life on the cross for us proves his love for us. Now he calls us to prove our love for him by loving one another. Becoming friends. Friends love each other. They help each other. They're part of each other's lives. When we're living like that, when we're loving like that, we truly walk as friends of Jesus. Let's pray.